So to begin, if there's nothing else, I call on Gabe Rusk to open the case for the proposition.
Cody and I would like to dedicate this speech to Newt Gingrich and Arnold Schwarzenegger. If they hadn't done what they had done, we wouldn't be here tonight. But more importantly, we also think it's appropriate that a team name is statutory only, or it's only statutory, it's also. But beyond the point, let's get into some substantive material. So Cody and I here today want to tell you that we think we should reestablish and radicalize what marriage has become. We think that it's been taken down a negative route in which the original intention of marriage, not necessarily for political means, but for means for interpersonal love and the ability for a family to grow, has been taken and perverted in multiple ways. So to look quickly at the model, we already see established jurisprudence in the way that we establish if someone has committed infidelity, such in divorce settlements. So we don't think there's going to be much debate on whether someone has committed infidelity. We also assume the infidelity has occurred usually in a consistent monogamous relationship, be it marriage or civil union. We think the gays can also access this. We'd love that. So moving forward, let's talk about specifically my two substantial issues, right? We think today we're not offering you a retributive reason for criminalizing infidelity. Rather, we're offering you a deterrence, where we think what we want to do is avoid these irreparable harms that exist in the status quo that are creating, I guess we would say, epidemic issues. So our first issue has to do with,
So does the state take this charge against an individual, or does their spouse?
Oh, we would assume because in existing divorce court settlements, what you have is a spouse accusing them. It usually be the spouse first, but you also have to have external evidence to actually solve this problem. There's usually a process that exists in the status quo. We would hope that that process could also be used here. But moving forward, what we think marriage has become becomes a political means and a tool in which to actually not necessarily enrich you as a personal, interpersonal being, but rather it's become something political and when it comes to monetary gain. We think we should radicalize what it can be. We don't think that that's like mutually exclusive. We think that we should change sex in the status quo, we should change infidelity in the status quo, we should change marriage in the status quo because we think it's heading in the poor direction. Let's talk about the direction in which it's headed, right? We think that sex in its exclusivity is really, really important. We think monogamy is the utmost important part of a marriage for a couple of reasons. First, we think sex and trust and exclusivity lead to something good in relationships, right? Why is sex more important when you're monogamous? We think that, for example, when you commit to an act of sex, as THW would say, you go from 1 to a 2, a unit of a 2. You're specifically surrendering yourself in a private sphere, right? But when you think you're in a monogamous relationship, you're surrendering yourself in such a way that sex becomes something private and that's something that becomes shared. We think it's really important for a couple of reasons. Because we think it's exclusive because you don't trust other people necessarily with that sex. So what we want to do is create a deterrent to prevent you from even beginning to think or think that maybe I should begin to internalize before I disrupt something that might be incredibly important, not only my existential understanding of love and sex, but more importantly, to a grander idea of whole. So what is this idea specifically? We think that monogamous marriage is a good thing, right? Like there's a new trend, specifically by feminist scholars, saying that you should be an ethical slut. And I think that there might be reasonable arguments why you should be an ethical slut. We think there are a lot more arguments for specifically why the idea of being a slut actually reprimands specifically why you got into that marriage to begin with. We think that it exists as a contract, though, thank you, not just between legal institutions, but between two people. We think that contract is really important, and when you disrupt that contract, it has really, really bad effects. Let's first go into the first one, right? We think the reason why adultery is high, divorce rates are high, specifically when sex therapists tell people what's the number one reason that actually couples break up, right? Or that they get divorced. It's because sex first, third, communication, and Facebook's actually working its way up there. Interesting fact. But we think that the reason why this is occurring is because the idea and the way we value actual sex between married couples is changing. We think this is changing for a couple of reasons. We think we could actually specifically look at pop culture, we could look at specifically how religions consider sex. What would you think it's changing because the casual nature that we consider currently in a paradigm of what we call this ethical slut, which we think is a bad thing, right? So why does this affect you in a bad way, and why should we avoid this? We think adultery is the ultimate harm on your personal being, right? Because what we think is that when you engage in a monogamous relationship, you're opening up yourself in such a way that you're saying, I, in my totality of my being, represent something that someone can reciprocate with, right? And when you violate that reciprocity, we think that is the most personal attack that you can make on a person, right? So this kind of leads to the idea of this punishment being like fraud, right? Where you originally agreed into a contract, specifically where you said you wouldn't violate some sacred, divine, political, or interpersonal code, but yet then you do it, before I move on.
Okay, so why is infidelity so important? in commitments when made to the state, but not just between two individuals.
Right. What we think specifically is that when you have two institutions incentivizing you to be like a partner that doesn't cheat, that obviously incentivizes you. But the fact of the matter is we think you have to have a third actor in place. In this case, it would be the punitive system telling you not to break that bond. Like, I don't think you gain any offensive ground by just pointing out like the semantic differences in the way we're arguing. But moving on specifically as why like adultery, infidelity is specifically really bad to you as a person, like I said before. We think about the relationships that you've been in, right? They represent something that you truly believe in, as in the most reduced grain of your own, again, being. And when you disrupt that, and when someone says specifically, we no longer actually value that, we think that hurts you. We think that there should be a proportional punishment because of that, right? So Cody will get more into why this will actually be effective, but why is this proportional punishment important, right? We think this becomes a discursive symbolic act when we say that infidelity in itself and the way it disrupts my ability to go through my life and be happy is really important. No, thank you. And I think when you have this as established means of saying specifically, we're going to condemn the concept of disrupting the way in which like interpersonal relationships exist in the status quo, we think this is really important and achieves a couple of things. We first think this will achieve like a decrease in divorce rates. We think that even though we'll talk about like the effect of deterrence, we think symbolically there's a retributive part of this, right? Where we think we begin to say, like, look, let's question the idea of the ethical slut, right? Let's question the idea of you thinking about committing infidelity. It means something else. It's not just this visceral reaction that you have when maybe hormones are raging at a certain time. No, when you commit the act and go through with it, and don't just think about it, it represents a disruption in the original interpersonal contract. Even if it's not an official state contract, but a contract you had between two people. We think it leaves really, really bad harms onto that individual. And we think that that deserves either a deterrence, but also a symbolic discursive move. We think that move is by reestablishing what sex really is. And it's an existential, interpersonal, dialogical connection you have with someone else. And if you say that's not what it's about, sex is reduced to its only visceral, hormonal, basically ejaculation. And we don't think that's a good thing, right? We think that you should re-establish why you have sex because there's a loving part of you that believes in it. So because sex is changing and we want to change it in a better way, because we think infidelity represents the manifestation of sex in a negative trend, and because we think this is irreparable harm that deserves a deterrence, but also a symbolic movement and act to specifically mitigate it, we are proud to propose.
Thanks, Gabe, for his fine speech, and call on John Engle to open the case for the opposition.
Three things in opening opposition. First, I'm going to talk about how this policy sort of has bizarre favoritism of marriage, which is bad. Second, we're going to talk about how this will adversely affect women in the particular. And thirdly, we're going to talk about how it will wreck relationships and the repairing of relationships after infidelities occur and before they do as well. So firstly, 3 points of rebuttal. So firstly told, like, monogamy is like the end-all, be-all. Like, isn't it great? Well, like, it is for some people. Like, some people like monogamy. Like, it's become like the cultural standard. But is it necessarily the one that everyone likes all the time? Like, no. Because that's like a stifling thing to say that the only way you can possibly love someone is not only by saying, I love you, but also we need to get the state up in here, and it has to make sure that when we make this decision, that it will then hold me criminally liable if I don't do it. Like, because that's just crazy. We say that, like, not everyone likes monogamy, not everyone can commit to it long term, that's why we have things like divorce, or do we not have divorce anymore? We like that from the proposition that apparently that's not okay. No, but they say that they tell us furthermore, like, sex is changing. And they say that that won't stop. Like, the people who aren't married can presumably still have, like, conscience-free sex. I mean, like, that's not necessarily problematic, because people enjoy it. It's part of, like, the human experience. That people, like, want to explore who they are, and having these bizarre restrictions placed upon them is necessarily going to harm them in that way. But secondly, they sort of tell us, like, what is, like, the marriage contract? Like, it's like a divine prerogative that the state can, like, bestow upon people. And they're like, okay, well, we'll have it for gay marriage too. But the problem is, the very fact that you're imputing sort of a civic divinity onto the identity of marriage is what is the problem. You're giving it, like, this higher standard that like you can then enforce in a monstrous way. Any decisions like involving the state when we do things like marriage has essentially become, or civil partnership, whatever you call it, is basically just a grab bag blanket term we use for some of the extra like legal benefits we can get when we agree to share our lives with another person. Like there is no divine imperative or moral good in that existence. We say that in trying to create that is hugely problematic, and trying to give a special moral character to that, because it doesn't exist. And simply asserting it doesn't make a case. Go ahead.
It already does exist, because marriages are state-recognized relationships. There's something special about them already.
No, what we say is that the state currently does some stuff like that, which is a problem that is currently being addressed and redressed. I'll talk about it in my first point. What we would further say is that rather, we should look at what the state offers as means of providing like legal protections for people who care about each other, rather than shackling people like into these sort of things. And thirdly, I'd say, I just have a question like what is the proportional punishment like for infidelity? I'd like to know exactly like what that is. It's hilarious. Let's talk about like the bizarre favoritism of marriage. Because I've sort of alluded to this already. It's like what marriage does when already in society has sort of like given a special sanctity. And we tell ourselves that it's not like any other kind of relationship, and that you need like state approval before you get this criminal protection. If what they actually care about is like people who love each other coming together in order to raise families, like this criminality of infidelity should surely exist beyond the state provision of whatever like they happen to define marriage as. Like the idea that somehow this betrayal necessitates criminal punishment like doesn't follow. But furthermore, we say that the breakdown in the conventional marriage structure that they so decry in the proposition has been a good thing. It's been the breakdown in what the conventional nuclear family that allows for things like gay marriage to come about. It allows things like polyamorous relationships to come about, to allow people to explore who they are and to seek out the best life that they can attain for themselves. We think like we question furthermore the desirability of promoting the notion of permanent relationships in the first instance. We say that like people can come together with the intent of raising children and having relationships for long term, but when you make it a criminal offense to be unfaithful, you necessarily impute a certain value in absolute permanence of the relationships. We say is firstly like unhealthy in a lot of regards, in the sense of like humans like often wanting to like change partners. But furthermore, we point out that it's just like really bizarre to do in a criminal fashion, which we haven't been really explained why that is the case. So thank you. Secondly, let's talk about this particularly adversely affects women. Because today already, like in many societies, even Western ones, like women, when they enter into marriage, marriages, cease to be individuals. And we're told by a proposition like this is what happens to everyone when they enter marriages. They cease being two and become one. But it is currently, and would be exacerbated under this policy, an asymmetric burden. Because men remain men in their households in Western cultures, while women become the wife of X and the mother of Y and Z. We think this notion we have fought for generations, to break down this notion. But this policy brings it back into full force. Why is that? Because we made the situation criminal. And when men cheat currently, and in general sense, when we see, when they are viewed by society, it's like they couldn't keep it in their pants. Whereas a woman is seen more as having directly assaulted the family unit, rather than simply acted wrongly as an individual. What does that mean? It means that when this becomes a criminal procedure, women will be necessarily more adversely affected as having been more severe betrayers of the relationship. But furthermore, we point out that the justice system is so slanted against them already in the fact that the white men who will be presiding in these courtrooms are already largely bought into the status quo system of monogamy. And because their political appointees are largely from stable, nuclear, heterosexual families, they will necessarily have a bias against those marginalized groups. Hugely problematic. Thirdly and finally, how does this actually wreck relationships? Because infidelity, contrary to what the proposition would say, is not actually doesn't always mean the end of marriages. Far from it. What does infidelity mean? It often is the result of people feeling trapped and not knowing what to do. We say that when you have this policy being criminal, people become less willing to talk to their spouse about the problems they have, because they face the risk of prosecution, for having such thoughts. We say that the feelings of entrapment are necessarily make it harder for those relationships to recover. but also after the fact of an infidelity occurring. Like oftentimes people feel remorse and want to reestablish the relationship that they have, and oftentimes the other spouse will be willing to. But when you make the societal message that what they did was criminal, what they did was so monstrous, this person must face criminal liability, you make it less likely for forgiveness ever to occur, and you make it much less likely for that relationship to ever be salvaged. If you care about marriages, you make it worse under this policy. Ladies and gentlemen, on every possible grounds the proposition uses, we move to oppose.
I'd like to thank John for his fine speech and calling Cody Walizer to lead the case for the proposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I'm very fortunate in this debate round that I'm not defending the motion that infidelity should be criminalized. It's specific to marriage, and I think that the last speaker simply ignores that. Like, he comes up here and he tells you a couple of different things. He talks a lot about how we paint the picture of monogamy as being extraordinarily important. We were going to say this before I really get into my substantive and my basic rule. Like, people who aren't married can hate on monogamy all they want. This is talking about people who are married, who have made the contractual obligation to their spouse, and we think that that's a very specific type of relationship. In addition to that, I'm going to talk about two things today. I want to talk about really why, like, criminalizing marriage is the only, or criminalizing infidelity in marriage, excuse me, not marriage, that would be bad, is the only way to, like, actually successfully access punishment and deterrence to that particular thing, but why it specifically works for marriage, not against it. So let's talk about a couple of different things that the last speaker said before we do. Like, he talks about civic divinity. And he basically accuses the proposition of establishing the entirety of, like, historical precedent for what marriage means to us. And I don't think that's fair, first of all, because, like, civic divinity existed before this round. It's going to exist after. And that's just the status quo, ladies and gentlemen. Like, we treat marriage, especially, just as this speaker brought to you, right? Like, and he says that there's no divine imperative or moral good that comes from this. I think this is a relatively shameful statement, especially in the sense that, like, there is definitely a moral good that comes from being fidelis, right? Like, you're not cheating, you're not a liar, you're not being bad, you must be being good in some way, right? We think that's probably going to be good. But, like, then he asks this question of what is the proportional punishment for marriage, or for infidelity in marriage? We say, like, we don't care what the proportional punishment is. We're going to send that right to where every single other proportional punishment gets decided, the courts. Is 26 years too much for a murderer? I don't really know. You don't know. Nobody really knows. We have institutions that decide that for us, right? So we think that that's not necessarily going to be a significant portion of this debate for our side. But then we want to establish, like, a burden on the opposition team in this particular case because we don't think that they're doing their job. We want them to address marital infidelity in and of, like, any type. We think the last speaker focuses heavily on heterosexual marriage. Notice that my esteemed partner, Gabe, thank you, buddy, did not even specify. We think that's also really important because, like, we don't comment on what type of marriage. We think that it necessarily will be punished in every type of marriage, whatever type of marriage the state sanctions, right? Well, and that's necessarily going to be important as we move on up now. You know, I think we can move on to my substantive. So let's talk about criminalization, how that's really the effective punishment here, like what that necessarily means. Like, what does it really entail? We think it's punishment by the state. We think that's specifically appropriate for reasons that may be obvious already. Like, you know, it's pretty simple. You're in a civil union, and it's sanctioned by the state, and yeah, it's with that person that you chose, and if you're infidelis, you violate that contract, right? With, yes, that person and the state. I.e., you're committing fraud, as Gabe brought to you already. You said you would pay, you know, that debt to one particular bank. Cheer here is more of like a wife or a husband in this case. And meanwhile, you're cashing checks at another bank, right? Like, that's probably wrong. It's bad. It's lying. And it's something we don't want in our society. I think that's the moral imperative to do good for the motion in and of itself. But, like, so what, right? Well, I think that we must criminalize infidelity in the sense that if we want it gone, that's really the only option we have. Can we tax infidelity? Not really. Can we put sanctions on infidelity? I highly doubt that. So really our only option is to make it punishable by crime. And yes, that could represent a financial fine, much like is the punishment, the state punishment for fraud in the first place. So, like, we think that this is going to work out, just in a very general logistic sense. So I'm going to talk about why this particularly works for marriage in our society and not against it. We think that, first of all, this is like the basic deterrence argument. Like, it prevents people from being infidelis, and in some cases, like, from getting married in the first place. Whoa! We think that's good for a couple of reasons. One, marriage naturally attains a higher value than it has in the status quo. Why is that good? Because it increases the amount of meaningful relationships society has within it. I'll take you in a second. And basically, like, these are relationships that are really important, right? They can produce or raise our children. Notice, you can adopt children, most emotion. Also, like, you can create familial values. You can provide the moral framework for our next generation, which I'll talk about in a second. And we think that's why criminalization is really important. But you disagree.
Your big harm of infidelity is that someone feels like their selfhood is being entirely rejected. Is that not also true of divorce?
See, that's not our harm. Our harm is that you have violated a contractual obligation, that you are committing fraud, and that you need to be punished for that. If your crime goes unpunished in that sense, there are multiple harms that we can talk about. I think Gabe, first of all, did a really good one. You're doing a disservice to relationships. You're doing a disservice to monogamy. You're doing a disservice to all of us in this room, because you are saying that, like, literally, in some way, infidelity is fine, especially in marriage. We don't think that that's something we want. But also, like, we think that infidelous marriages happen less often under the model, and that's going to be pretty good because, like, infidelity is bad. I've already told you it's immoral. There is definitely a moral imperative to not do it. So therefore, like, the motions are pretty good. But also, like, marriage takes deeper commitment and consideration, which we think is also probably good to reduce the amount of, like, doomed to start marriages, like the marriages that happen in Las Vegas, at these crazy chapels where you can get married in a matter of 2 hours. You don't think? But let's take a really big second to think about who's really important. And I think that that's the next generation. Like, forget about us. We suck. We're going to die very soon. And we honestly have a legacy to leave behind. We need to think about what that legacy is, right? Our children raised under this model, think about what their whole lives would be like. Their whole lives would be completely different. Like, the media would represent things differently. They would represent cheaters differently. They would represent marriage differently. They would represent our families differently. And so would our unmarried be represented and thought about differently. Perhaps they could see the value, the commitment, the true power of true love and sacrifice for a relationship that is truly worth it. Like, in times of health and sickness, in good times or bad times, for always and forever. Oh, that was so cheesy, I know. But, like, we say to you guys that we have an opportunity, like a serious one though, for real, to change our interpersonal relationships in such a positive way that it will provide for meaningful and everlasting relationships, right? Like, this will, for the people who want to get married, mind you. Like, for the people who really just don't care about that, like, they still exist, they're under the model too. It's just that, like, marriage becomes better. You think, like, the family, whether or not there's 2 fathers, 2 mothers, or a husband and wife, and 2 kids, and a dog and a white picket fence, all benefit from this particular motion, but so too does the single person. So too does the person who is just sitting at home wondering about what that relationship, potential relationship, would mean. We think that they gain an appreciation for people who are in monogamous relationships. We think they gain an appreciation for monogamy itself. We think they gain an appreciation for fidelity. We think that's really, really important because now in our culture, ladies and gentlemen, more than ever, we are hypersexualized. We are bent to believe that being evil and having fun is really the only way to do it. And we on Side Proposition are here to tell you that that's not true. We must change our way of thinking before we doom ourselves to being ethical. Thank you.
Cody for his fine speech and call on Adam Noonan to continue the case for the opposition.
In tackling the suppressed, uptight, and incredibly sexually frustrated Proposition bench, I want to do a couple of things for you in continuing the case for Proposition. First of all, I want to talk to you about love, marriage, why it's not a golden carriage, more like a Fiat Punto. Mostly we're going to talk about its effects on women and how this massively disadvantages them once again in an institution that for its entire history has been used as a way to oppress them and for men to lay ownership. Lastly, I'm going to talk to you about creating more valued kids, how this enhances the perception that the best and only way to actually raise a family is through the nuclear mode, through one man and one woman, and how you actually offer more protection to that, you make it out to be more worthwhile and a better way to actually do something. But first of all, a couple of points of refutation. Like, first of all, people don't get married thinking that they'll cheat. It's not something that quite often will come into the head of someone who spends like a considerable amount of time with a person before they actually get married, and then a considerable amount of time afterwards before this desire comes on, the 7-year itch or whatever you want to call it, to do it. So we don't think you like disincentivize those who would like see themselves as potentially cheating from getting married and destroying those monogamous relationships, because that's not something that you tend to think of. Like if you do, you're probably not going to get married in the first place. Most people don't. Secondly, that those people will not get married. But I thought that's what the prop wanted. Like, why is married sex so special? Like, again, you might encourage people to play around before they get married because they know they might be charged for it. But we'd ask the question, like, why should someone else own your sexuality when you get married? Like, within the contract, like, there's a contract that you create with the state with another person to tie yourselves to them financially in that particular manner. But there's no clause that particularly claims that they can own what you consider to be your sexuality. We think that's incredibly harmful to grant someone that power, particularly when as I go on to describe you, the power asymmetries that exist within the institution of marriage, as well as societal perception around what marriage is actually supposed to be. No thank you. So let's get on to love, marriage, and the fiat point. Historically, marriage has been an institution or a process by which men lay claim to women, to bind them, to safeguard a supposed purity that women contain within them that can be damaged if they were to have sexual relations with more than one particular man, to liberate them from that terrifying thing that is independence, from that awful shame that can be spinsterhood, so they can focus on what their life is truly about, and that is breeding. And I use it in that sense, not having a child, breeding, because that is what it is seen as. It is an institution which for a woman to leave has been historically devastating. In the last 30 years, women who have been divorced from their husbands experience a drop in living quality of 72%, while their divorced male spouses rise up by 43%. It is something that disadvantages them from the get-go when they get involved, and we think to add further caveats to that does it more. Why is that? Because as John tells you, and it's just not responded to whatsoever by the opening government teams, is that they are couched when they are married, they are couched in terms of their husband. This is the wife of X or their children, this is the mother of Y or Z. Society creates an allegiance for women when they get married to the husband and the family that simply does not exist for their male counterparts. It is a burden that is never placed. John tells you how it's seen that when a man cheats on his wife, he is seen as not being able to keep it in his trousers. Whereas, like, they are called not an ethical slut, but just a regular slut for when they do it. The consequences are so much greater. Their transgression is seen as such a greater assault on the proper family unit, or something that should actually exist. No, thank you. Because Cody says, I don't know what the punishment is. We'll just send them to the courts to let them find out. That would be fine if courts and judicial processes existed in a vacuum and societal prejudice didn't actually have a part to play in how people are treated before the law. Discrimination exists within the courts. The attitude that John's outlines to you exists within those courts as well. Couple examples. For example, there's harsher sentences for users and sellers of crack cocaine, whereas of the 100% of cocaine consumed, 20% is crack cocaine. African Americans more regularly consume that, whereas 80% of regular cocaine is consumed by Caucasians, and they receive much lower sentences because of the discrimination that exists within the court system. We do our utmost to keep white-collar criminals out of jail. We do our utmost to see that they don't see the same time as those who are seen less than them in society. When you do this, you make the consequences for women of actually being persecuted by this so much more. You add another shackle that keeps them tied to a relationship, which ultimately, unless they're quite lucky, will not suit them for their entire lives. And now what you also do is you give complete ownership of their sexuality to their male partners. And I'll take Bob in a second. So that now they are repressed in that sense as well and cannot seek refuge from any other source, bar the man that they no longer love, that they no longer have sex with. Bob.
The fact that women are treated unequally in the court system is a reason for making the court system treat them more equally, not to not criminalise infidelity in marriage.
That'd be fine, except for the couple of examples that I gave of how there is laws that actually will actually punish one group more harshly than the other because of the societal prejudice that already exists within the largely white male judicial bodies that tend to govern large swathes of the judicial system within particular states. We think that's quite clear. When you have such a shaming put on women who actually leave their families or cheat on their spouses is so much greater than what falls on their male counterparts now. Enshrining that in law just brings the attitude along with it. Just because there is an equal law over it doesn't mean that the fallout, once they are charged, once they are convicted, will in any way be better for women, but it will stay the same for men, as they are seen as less important, as they are seen as having committed a smaller transgression. Let's talk about creating more valued kids. Because offspring are synonymous with heterosexual marriage. Now these guys talk about, we'll include gay marriage as well. There's like 5 places where you can get that, a few more where you can get civil unions. The vast amount of marriages that actually exist are heterosexual marriages. These are the vast majority of cases that we're actually going to be dealing with, the ones that actually involve women. Because when you do this, you do place a value judgment on the products that a marriage produces. Like you assume that people will get utmost happiness from this, so you safeguard that with the law. You also assume that children in a heterosexual marriage have a hell of a lot much more to lose, so there is some value in actually making it harder for their family to split up. This assumes that children in these particular relationships are more valuable or could be damaged to a greater extent than the children that exist in other forms of unions between people, in other forms of families. It privileges the nuclear family, the heterosexual family, before the law. It says that this is something that is more special. The products that it produces are more special, so therefore it requires more legal protection. We think this is a horrible precedent to set, particularly when as a society we have moved towards actually breaking down the view that the best place to be raising a child is under one man and woman, and we think their children are going to get on pretty poorly when both their mother and father hate each other and you try and keep together. We beg to oppose.
Thank Adam for his fine speech and call on Brian and Byrne to extend the case for the proposition.
Speech with a clarification. Infidelity is where you breach the trust of your partner. So in a relationship, you can still engage in all sorts of freaky shit and all sorts of polygamy once it's based or derived from an agreement between the partners. That's a fundamental misconception that underpins the opposition case. Your partner doesn't own your sexuality. Your partner holds it in trust. And if you both agree that you want to have a threesome or a foursome or do whatever you like to do, whatever floats your boat, then that's fine. What we have a problem with is infidelity, where you breach your partner's trust. Now, the first proposition came up and gave you a case that was primarily based upon preventative reasons. Why they would criminalise infidelity so that they could stop future infidelities. Our case is retributive. Why? Because if you cheat on your spouse, you are a bastard. You deserve to be punished, and we will leave it up to judicial discretion, but we're happy to say that that judge should punish the shit out of you. Because you breached your partner's trust. You unleashed the beast as a world. You didn't keep the snake in the cage, and we think that you are punishable precisely for that reason. A social stigma should attach to you for those actions. And we say it's a nonsense to say, as they do in the first opposition, that somehow these are people who just feel trapped. That's nonsense, because we still accept that people can go to their spouse, tell them that they're unhappy, and end the relationship. It makes utterly no sense. In fact, you're an idiot if you think the way to make things better when you're trapped is go and sleep with some hooker or your secretary. It makes utterly no sense. So we say, this whole idea, furthermore, and most of my speech is rebuttal, it has no structure. This isn't British parliamentary debating, guys. No thanks. So Engle says that it's unhealthy to lock people into these relationships. So like when somebody is sent to prison after being unloyal to their spouse, that what are they going to do after that? Well, we say actually, that's likely to facilitate some sort of reconciliation, because the cheating partner will have paid his penance. And so that's a means to generating a discourse where it regenerates a parity in moral culpability between the two parties. So we say, moreover, the reason that we're doing this is because the social repercussions that originally existed for people who cheat have waned. It's because of the moral decay of our society. It's somehow acceptable for people to go off and cheat. It's the norm. And we say that's bullshit. People should be punished for doing this because it's a bad thing. What are the harms they ask? The fact that somebody gives up their entire life, has children with you, gives up all their future plans. What are the harms? When you cheat, you ruin all of that. We would go so far as to say that it's far worse than physical harm because it's a total psychological and ontological fallout. The very world has been pulled from beneath their feet and they should be punished just as severely as somebody who happens to assault somebody on a Saturday night. And we say criminalisation is particularly apposite in these circumstances because criminalisation, is used for crimes of passion. And that's exactly the type of act that cheating on your wife is. Furthermore, criminalisation is perfect for this because criminalisation is used to protect institutional frameworks that are there to protect the state. For example, customs tariffs. So we say, in the exact same way, marriage is an institution of the state. It is the state's interest to have something like marriage, as it says in Article 44 of the Irish Constitution, because it is a fundamental unit group of the society. Whether you agree with that or not, that's what it says now. There's obviously some weird interpretations of it. We also say, just to reiterate, as the first prompt said, that this will give people pause. They will think before entering the marriage, particularly if there's somebody who can't keep it in their pants. And those are the people that we don't want to marry in the first place. No thank you. So, what about this idea that we get from Adam, that cheating husbands post-divorce get on better? And so this is really this is really bad if we introduce this, because when women get caught cheating, that's like leaving the husbands better off even further relative to the wife. We say, if cheating husbands get off better, then fuck them. Let's make it more difficult for them. Let's throw them in prison and stop the fact that they're doing so much more better. Okay, I'll take that.
Alright, all of the kind of harms, the feeling of betrayal, the feeling that it's all been thrown away, can equally be delivered to a spouse by someone coming up and claiming out of the blue that they want a divorce. Why don't you get rid of
Absolutely not, because civil action is something entirely contingent. It's not taken by the state. It's not a representation of state morality. It's a private actor deciding that they feel aggrieved. So it's entirely different. This is a message sent by the state to society that this is something that is morally abhorrent and that they won't stand for it and won't rely on private actors to take the case for them. And just about all this stuff about women, we say all of that about women being, and we accept it entirely, women being treated worse in the court system now. We say that's a reason for changing the court system and equalising that. No, thank you. It's not a reason to not punish infidelity. And we say furthermore, women are now in a disadvantageous position because they're expected to try and hold this marriage together that they have kids with, for example, because that's just the sort of misogynistic patriarchal role that's been carved out for them. We want to change that, and the way we're going to do it is by saying, listen, don't worry about holding the marriage together. We accept the fact that your husband cheating was an abhorrent thing to do, and we're going to punish him for you to set things right. And finally, we say that this whole idea that we're interfering with some sort of private moral relationship is a nonsense, because marriage is already a public institution. When you get married, you make a public commitment through a state institution. So it already has this civic divinity. It already has this sacred nature, and it's something that it's endowed with by the state. That's why we think the state is the one who has to take the reins here, has to take a stand against the moral decay that is currently perforating throughout our society and criminalise infidelity in marriage. Thank you.
Call on Mark Haughton to extend the case to the opposition. Come on, Coyle.
Alright, ladies and gentlemen,
take a look at the criminal system and why it is an inadequate system for dealing with the kind of restitution and retribution that we've got a desire for in the last speech. I'll give that some consideration and tell you that it is in fact not actually applicable. Then I want to move on and ask the big question in this debate. Why is it that marriage is different, and why is it that we value and respect marriages, and what does this proposition do to those marriages as a result of its existence? Right. So the first thing then, let's talk about the criminal system, right? So we just heard an awful lot about how a person who has caused you harm is a person that you have a right to gain restitution from, a right to gain retribution over. And we think that relationships are things that you enter into both unaware of where it is that that relationship is going to go, and both unaware of how it is that you are going to change as that relationship grows, as that relationship turns into something else. Relationships, in essence, are about revealing different parts of yourself that you were never aware of when you went into them. Particular flaws that people may have come to the fore, right? But they are very much situational and cannot be foreseen beforehand, in that nobody knows before they enter into a marriage how exactly they're going to feel after 8 or 9 years into that marriage, after their partner has changed and after they have changed. So they're very much journeys of discovery is the first thing to look at. But there are also things where the things that you discover about that person may not be the things that you expected that you would find out about them when you first entered into that marriage and entered into that relationship. No thanks. And those things may indeed be things that you do not like. They may be things that certainly hurt you when you find those things out. However, those are things about those particular individuals and not things that they have done to you in terms of a crime that they commit, like it would be if they were to hit you in that particular relationship, which obviously is a crime. But something like infidelity is different, because it is how somebody reacts in a certain situation, given a certain opportunity. So it is that someone finds out something about their partner that they didn't know before. So what actually happens, or what should happen in that situation, is that the other partner then has the right to decide whether the sum of what they knew about that person before that instance actually is greater than what they have learned on that particular day and in that particular moment. So it is clear in that instance that this is a negotiation of the roles that those individuals feel that they have for themselves and the roles which they feel that the other person should have within that relationship. But it is not clear that there is one catch-all that is suitable for everybody in that situation. It is not clear, for instance, that if your partner of 10 years, you've been married for 10 years, happens to kiss somebody else at the work party while very drunk, that is automatically grounds for divorce. That is an unclear thing. That is up to each individual's judgment. When the state sends out the message that one thing is criminal, and it is criminal in that particular instance, and that person therefore must feel wronged in that particular instance, that robs those partners of that ability to grow through that particular instance, and it changes in effect what that marriage is. No thank you. We think in terms of restitution, there is already an ability there in terms of civil cases for people to gain restitution for relationships which have gone wrong. Very different to retribution. Very different to what we do when we use the criminal system, which is to punish a harm not just against one particular individual, but against everybody that exists within society. So if it was true, for instance, that there was a harm to the institution of marriage, I'm very sure there is not, then that would be grounds for accepting this proposition. In the same way that there are harms to everybody when murder exists within our society, not just to the person who's actually targeted by that, because of the fear that that might engender, or because of the way that means that people look at people differently and expect different things from people. So the criminal system, therefore, is for harms to all of society. So, therefore, the key question in this debate is, what is it about marriage that is different, and what is it about marriage that we respect? So before I go and talk about that, I'll take it.
Okay, yeah, so we acknowledge the fact that there's flexibility in marriage, right? But why does the solution have to be in a circumstance? Like, we told you in our model, people can come forward with this. The person that's presenting the problem is in the
but once you make something illegal, you make a very clear, bright line that is something that is always wrong in every situation. So people know their default has changed. Their default now, which they get from society, is yes, that is bad, but it is something which some couples work past and other couples don't. You change that default, you rob them of their ability to grow together in that instance. Let's talk about why marriage is different. Because the different thing when we look at marriage and when we look at non-married couples is that there is a societal recognition of that particular relationship. But what does that societal recognition actually recognize? It recognizes and it respects, most importantly, the value of that particular relationship to those individuals. The value of that trust and that togetherness of those two people, and the positive values that actually creates for the society that interacts with two people who are more comfortable in and of themselves and more comfortable within their surroundings because they feel like they have met, as the cliche goes, their perfect match. So that's why there is that particular respect. Its value, therefore, is tested in moments of weakness. Whether or not that trust and whether or not that togetherness actually exists is something that we simply cannot know until that moment where there is another option on the table. Until that moment where somebody is slightly drunk, perhaps. That's when we really see, does that trust exist? Is that togetherness really there? What it means, if there's a deterrent, as these guys say, is that society gets into your head at that moment of weakness. At that chance where there is the opportunity for somebody to cheat. They're not cheating because they are scared of going to prison. That means it is not the relationship, it is not that togetherness that is something that that individual is valuing in that particular moment in time. And so it is not the relationship that we originally recognized that is holding those two people together. We have changed it fundamentally when we have got inside their heads and kept them together through fear rather than through the desire to actually honor their partner. So it's something else that's binding them together. If you need that deterrent in your relationship, that entire relationship is a lie, and you are entitled to know that that relationship is a lie, and to choose whether or not you are willing to put in the work to grow through that particular lie. If your husband is only not cheating because he's scared of going to prison, he is not actually honoring you, and he is not trusting you, and so therefore he is not worthy of your trust. So the institution of marriage is certainly not honored by this particular proposition. We need only look at divorce to show that this is the case. Divorce strengthens marriage because people can leave that marriage now at any moment whatsoever. They have to make the active choice every single day to actually remain in that marriage, to put the work in. That means that marriage is something that is far more important to those people than it could ever be when they were trapped in it. This is exactly the same case when people are able to be infidels if they want to be. You remove that from those individuals, you weaken marriage and make it no longer worthy of societal recognition. I move to a close.
I'd like to thank Mark for his fine speech and call on Eoin O'Leon to close the case for the proposition.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to close the case for the proposition, defend the sanctity of marriage amongst college students. Myself and Brian know a lot about the subject. We plan one day to marry each other. So we're actually doing this for ourselves. Thank you, Jamie, whatever that was. Okay, so I'm a little nervous talking to you because I really like, seeing marriage and, it all connotes this sort of, it's traditional and it's this sort of right-wing kind of attitude. But Bob and I see a lot of value in protecting the sanctity of marriage, which I will reveal to you presently. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? I'm going to tell you the case of the postmodern moral decay that has set in and infected upon this society that we're all, we're all citizens in. We're going to talk about law and its role in protecting harmful people, and that in this case is that emotional harm that anyone that's been in any sort of relationship knows and can imagine in a marriage in much worse case, and then quickly look at feminism. That seems to be inevitably a point in the debate. Okay. Well, to get that one out of the way, as always, right? These guys have presented this sort of Cartesian equation in which woman goes into court, woman is screwed over, and woman goes out of court. We don't really recognize this necessarily to be the case. We think this is rather favorable. If that's the case, maybe we shouldn't let women in the courts at all if they're going to be always as Bob pointed out, we think that's a separate issue that exists that should be dealt with and not just assumed to be a problem and so we think we think that's a separate issue. We don't necessarily buy the premise of it as well. They said that, of course, that women will be screwed over by it. But actually, we think this helps them because statistically, a lot of men screw over women by screwing other women, okay? So it's a true story. So what happens is we're trying to prevent this sort of action by creating a stigma that no longer exists, I'll explain that later on, to those probable men who are doing this action. We think this actually falls on our side of the house in terms of trying to protect women in a relationship, that they're no longer just a piece of meat in which the man can go off and do whatever he wants, come back and presumably get a sandwich or whatever, but actually it's something that the state does recognize and wants to enforce. Okay, that's the feminism. No thanks. Okay. So in this postmodern world of moral decay, where there's talk of polyamorous, a euphemism for a legalized orgy and everything else, right? We recognize that the social context of marriage has really been undermined. That the social recognition of that has been eroded to an extent that it lacks a sort of importance, which really it does warrant because of the role it does play in society. Okay, I can blame a lot of people. We can just they've admitted that also already, so I won't go into it. Okay. Fortunately, some people, namely Bob and I, see the sanctity in that sort of promise that people make. Okay, for the obvious reasons that have been already addressed in terms of that John doesn't want to talk about or whatever. There is a stability in opting into a state-recognized marriage in terms of a family union. When you contractually make a promise to stick by someone, okay, and raise a family in that scenario, you recognize that that is in fact a good social environment to raise a child. Okay, we recognize that that is something that the state does promote, and we're okay with preferencing that. Okay, we think gay marriage should be okay. No, thank you. But you can deal with that again in a separate issue. But the question is, does a stable monogamous relationship help society? We think it does. We think statistics show that that the people who are banded together, who stay in mutual cooperation, have a better chance and a better environment to raise kids and to get on. We don't think we're enforcing permanence by these guys saying thing. We don't think we're going to you're now shackled, as was the words. We think divorce exists. That's fine. The problem is when you make that promise to someone and then go against it, you're sort of causing a deception. Okay, and we think that's no thanks. Okay, no thanks. Okay, so what this in fact does is it stops people from doing that, right? Because now you have this, to supplement that moral decay, you have now a state recognition of the importance of that stability that we said warrants, right? We think that this will stop people cheating because we think criminality is an incentive to most people, okay? We think that it therefore preserves the relationship because in that heat of the moment, that now is a factor in their calculus and thinking. Rather than I'll get away with it, it doesn't matter, it's not a big deal in society. Actually, it's a state-recognized architecture, which we think that prevent them. We think, Mark told us that people, if they're scared of going to prison, that's a really bad reason of making it. Well, incentives to go to prison works for a lot of other crimes, so we think that exists, and we think actually it prevents a problem. It does prevent them because they no longer commit that deceit to another individual. So, while they can get out of that marriage if they want, they no longer have to do it in they can't do it in a deceitful way, which damages another person. I'll take you, John. You seem eager.
Do you think that the reason marriages are so favored are because they're the only form of stable relationship, or just because they've been a useful means of social control?
No, I think they are a useful means of social cohesion. Yes, empirically. Thank you for admitting it. And therefore, we do want to promote. We think you can expand that into other groups like gay marriage, not necessarily polygamy, which is what you're talking about. But now that lacks those stable factors and introduce paradigms to know that. So what this does is it deters people from entering into marriage if they're not serious about it, if they're not going to make that commitment. And we think it creates a social stigma for them. Why is this a good thing? Well, as Brian mentioned, we think actually the law should probably do something in a retributive sense to try and protect people from serious harm. While we do legislate for if you spit in someone's face or you punch them or whatever on a night out, that's a bad thing. We also think that this exists in the realm of sentiment and emotion, because if someone promises to live with you forever and in sort of marriage bond, and then goes against that, you can only imagine the damage that causes that person in such an internal sense. As Bob listed, we have a psychological and emotional traumatizing. You disrupt their plans for the future, which they previously held to be by the fact themselves. You deceive them of their intentions, robbing them of a chance perhaps of meeting someone else to be stable with by taking up their time. And if you've also created a self-perceived stigma on that person. All these sort of serious harms to people and also to children it makes are real harms rather than emotional. They still affect that person on such a deep level that we think that the law has to sort of protect that person for in terms of a recourse. But as I said, creating incentives to mitigate this and reduce it, but also to give them a recourse in themselves. We think that it's akin to physical assault as exists in current law. We just think it hasn't gone to the extent of someone knowingly deceiving someone else in this way. Okay, so summary ad lib. Okay, we think that the marriage serves a purpose in society. We think that stable relationships, monogamy, and sort of raising children and that thing is something that we can preference, but has lost its ability to be able to do that because of a social decay. What can help with this is a state action, like preferencing that and including it, and feminism is an issue, guys. So, like, we'll stay proposed. Thanks.
I'd like to thank Eoin for his fine speech and call on Michelle to conclude the case for the opposition and indeed the debate.
Okay. We started the day of this idea of animaniacs earlier, of good idea, bad idea. This has reoccurred here, except as again, bad idea for this proposition. First of all, I want to look at in Sumerian case, do we think that criminalising marital infidelity, as first proposition would like us to believe, strengthens these relationships, strengthens the interpersonal relationships that exist between the spouses? We'd say no. Second of all, I want to look at why the state perhaps has an undue influence in controlling how that relationship ends up. And we don't necessarily think that they get to determine like what this moral decay is and why we think that's pretty problematic and doesn't exist. Okay, launching straight into it. Like first of all, do we think that criminalising marital infidelity strengthens these relationships? Not so much. Okay, like let's have an actual reality check as to these marriages, as to actual couples, and when relationships break down. When you have a situation right now, when people are in a moment of weakness, what stops them and what forces them to resist the temptation when you're in Dicey's, I don't know, like on a €2 drinks night, and like, instead of coppers or whatever, instead of shifting someone when you're in a marriage, like, or whatever, get the ride. Like what stops you from going to that level, from breaking your like vows, is your partner, is your love and trust of your spouse. You change that when you have a third party called the state, who now instead of seeing your partner's face, instead of like when you're resisting temptation, you now see a prison cell. You change how that relationship is defined. You demean the value of within their relationship. You demean the love and trust that exists between those two individuals. When now you can never know whether you resisted temptation because I love my spouse so much I would never cheat on them, or whether that niggling doubt is I don't want to end up in jail because of the deterrence they talk about. We think that's pretty bad when Mark gives you the analysis as to why the state recognises marriages as being so special in the first place. Because the state recognises the love between these individuals, recognises the trust that exists, recognises how special it is, and wants to recognise that fact to the world and allows people to do that. You demean that recognition when you instead say the only reason that you stay together, the only reason that you don't cheat on someone is now because you probably would have ended up in jail. We think that's pretty bad. No thank you, you didn't deal with it in your summation. Okay, because we don't think, like Mark tells you, why divorce is so like pertinent, why it's so beneficial to marriage. Because you can opt out, because you have that freedom to do so. Like we think that that's demeaned like within this situation because it's staying together within relationships when you could cheat on them. Staying together within relationships which have this value has more meaning when you stay together with this, where you have this love and trust and bonds. We think that's demeaned within these situations when you add the state as a third party actor that you have to think about in terms of your relationship, which should be true between two individuals who love each other. Now instead the state is a third party that we must involve within our decision-making and calculus, which should be a relationship between two people. We think that's pretty problematic in maintaining the value of that relationship that the state wants to uphold to begin with.
Right, we never acknowledge that like marriages are imperfect, or people that are imperfect. Rather, we say we want to give you the benefit of the doubt and add something to that that will prevent you from making a drunken mistake. Okay.
The fact of the matter is, if you love your spouse so much, you don't need that. You don't need that deterrence to stop you. You should love your spouse enough not to want to do so. But second of all, even if you have that moment of doubt, even if you have that, and want to go and confess to your spouse what you did because you feel that burden of having made that mistake, you now necessarily are less likely to do so because you feel the fear that they might send you to jail that exists, that hangs over your head and can ultimately destroy that relationship because you can never come clean. You can never have a truthful relationship ever again if you have one relapse because your jail sentence hangs in the balance. We think that's pretty problematic. We don't think that strengthens the relationship at all, but rather, as I've talked about, demeans it, and no analysis from second proposition as to that. No thanks. Okay, second of all, why does the state have an overreaching control of these relationships? Because, as Mark outlined, when you enter into a relationship, you don't know what's going to happen. Even a marriage, you don't know 20 years down the line how you'll still feel about the person. That's why we allow divorce. That's why second proposition are happy to have divorce. Because they acknowledge that you can opt out. They can acknowledge that you change as a person. Because we're constantly changing as we get older, or younger. You're constantly changing. I'm not getting old. You're constantly changing, and you're constantly growing as a person. Divorce acknowledges that, you can change within that. But instead, no thank you. But instead now, you see a situation where people aren't able to come forward, so they can't grow as a person and never come clean about past transgressions. They always have to live with that burden of conscience because they don't perhaps want to end up in jail. But second of all, no thank you. That the person who is wronged, the person who has been hurt, who we all acknowledge is the person who the harm is done to, is now told that they have been harmed in a certain way, they have to get retribution in a certain way, that this is the right way to interpret their relationship. This is the right way that they have been harmed, and this is how they should seek punishment upon that person. That's pretty bad. Why? Because they don't get to make their own decision. You've taken you've put an influence upon them, sent a message to them that they need to interact with their partner by sending them to jail because they've done something so heinous as second proposition tell you that they need to go to jail. We think that's pretty bad. They never get to make that decision for themselves. They never get to make the decision about their relationship for themselves because the state has intervened to such an extent. But also, when second proposition get up here and talk to us about why you need this punitive measure, you create a situation where marriage becomes tit for tat. You should punish your partner because he lied to you about smoking behind your back, or whatever it is. The marriage isn't about punishing partners. It's about having a trust within that relationship, and it's about growing as people. It's about deciding for yourselves what kind of relationship you want, talking to each other, communication, not having a jail sentence at the end of the day to stop your partner cheating on you. We think that's pretty bad. But also that we don't think that by adding this punitive level that is beneficial to having a relationship overall, when instead you're taught that you should punish your partner when they've done something wrong to you. Rather, we think that you should encourage relationships to talk to each other, to talk about whether they should stay together because that's the decision they want to make. We think on our side of the house, with all the harms that we've brought to you today, we think that this is definitely a bad idea. Good idea is voting for second